In the scorching summer of AD 70, the world held its breath. Rome, scarred by civil war yet unbroken in ambition, turned its wrath upon Jerusalem. Behind the city's towering walls, famine and bloodshed reigned, while outside the legions of Titus tightened their iron grip. What followed was not just a siege, it was the collision of faith and empire, of defiance and vengeance. This is the tale of fire and ruin, where destiny itself bent beneath the will of Rome. Stay with us as we journey through betrayal, fire, and conquest, the siege that reshaped history and sealed Rome's eternal legacy. Witness the clash of faith and empire, and don't forget to subscribe for more epic tales of war and empire. The year was AD 66, and the province of Judea burned with fury. What began as whispers of discontent swelled into a thunderous roar of rebellion. The Jews, long oppressed under Roman rule, rose not with timid protests but with blades unsheathed and hearts set aflame. Fortresses of Rome were stormed, garrisons overwhelmed, and entire cohorts cut down amidst the cries of vengeance. In the streets of Jerusalem, Roman blood flowed like rivers, staining the stones of the holy city. Standards of the legions, the sacred eagles of Rome, were seized and torn apart, their wings ripped as if to mock the empire itself. To the Roman mind, there was no greater sacrilege. The eagle was not merely a symbol of military might, it was the soul of the legion, a divine protector consecrated to Jupiter. To lose it was unthinkable. To see it defiled was an act of defiance that shook Rome to its core. But in Jerusalem, those same standards were paraded in triumph, while Roman officials and sympathizers were hunted down and slaughtered. The once subdued province declared, with blood and fire, that it would bow no longer. At first, Rome hesitated. The empire was stretched thin, its legions scattered across the vast dominions of the Mediterranean. Rebellions were nothing new. Rome had crushed dozens before. Yet Judea was different. The land was a tinderbox of faith and identity, where resistance was more than politics. It was divine duty. Every death of a Roman soldier became a sacrifice to freedom. Every act of violence was sanctified by belief. For 4 years the war raged. Cities were sacked, villages razed, and tens of thousands perished. The Romans struck back with merciless ferocity, reclaiming ground. But the heart of the rebellion, Jerusalem, remained untamed. Behind its triple walls and steep valleys, the city transformed into an impregnable fortress. Rebel factions swelled with zealots who would rather die than submit. But their unity was a fragile illusion. Within the very walls they sought to defend, chaos reigned. Famine gnawed at the city's soul. Food stores dwindled, yet rival factions turned upon one another instead of uniting against the common enemy. Streets that should have echoed with prayer and hope were instead filled with screams of brother killing. Brother. Rebel warlords vied for supremacy, torching one another's granaries, spilling blood on altars meant for worship. Mothers searched in vain for bread, while the wealthy hoarded scraps and the poor withered in the shadows. It was in this storm of madness that the shadow of Rome returned in full. By AD 70, the Flavian dynasty had risen from the ashes of civil war. Vespasian, once a general, now emperor, required a victory to prove his right to rule. And what victory could be greater, more symbolic than the crushing of Jerusalem, the city that had dared defy Rome's might? Thus he sent his son, Titus, a commander still young in years, but seasoned in war, to deliver the fatal blow. With him marched the legions, veterans of countless campaigns, the 5th Macedonica, the 10th Fretensis, the 15th Apollinaris, and more. Their armor gleamed beneath the Levantine sun, their discipline unshaken, their resolve fueled by vengeance. When Titus encamped before Jerusalem, the city trembled. The legions built their siege works with methodical precision, raising walls of timber and earth that encircled the holy city like an iron noose. The rebels, desperate but unyielding, hurled insults from the ramparts, swearing that God himself would strike down the invaders. Yet within, despair deepened. Famine devoured the weak. Corpses piled in the streets. The air reeked of rot, while the cries of the starving rose heavenward like a dirge. It was a tragedy on a scale the ancient world could scarcely imagine. A city sacred to millions, turned into a charnel house. What had begun as a cry for freedom now descended into ruin, and the shadow of Rome, vast and merciless, loomed over Jerusalem. The fate of Judea and of Rome itself would be decided here, in the crucible of fire, famine, and faith. In the summer of AD 70, as the blazing sun scorched the hills of Judea, one man carried upon his shoulders the burden of empire and the weight of destiny. His name was Titus Flavius Vespasianus. Titus, son of the new emperor Vespasian, commander of the legions, heir to Rome's hopes. Though but 30 years of age, his hair already streaked with the silver of battle, and his eyes bore the gravity of a man who had seen too much of war, yet could not escape it. From his earliest days, Titus was marked for greatness. Born into the Flavian family, not of the highest nobility, but of steady strength, he grew under the shadow of an ambitious father who clawed his way from obscurity to the purple of Rome. Titus was educated in the arts of rhetoric and law, but it was the clash of arms that truly defined him. He served in Britannia, where storms and barbarian spears tested the steel of his youth. He rode in Germania, where forests swallowed men whole and war was a brutal teacher. He fought at his father's side in Judea, where he learned that conquest was not merely about swords and shields, but about patience, cruelty, and the psychology of dominion. When civil war tore Rome apart in the year of the four emperors, Titus stood with his father. He watched chaos consume the empire as generals proclaimed themselves Caesars, armies clashed across Italy, and Rome itself burned with uncertainty. Yet through it all, Vespasian emerged triumphant. The Senate hailed him emperor, but the throne of Rome was fragile, its legitimacy questioned. The Flavian dynasty required more than proclamations. It needed a spectacle of power so overwhelming that no rival could challenge it. And so upon Titus's shoulders fell the task of annihilating Jerusalem. He was not merely a commander, but the very embodiment of Rome's vengeance. For the Jews had humiliated the empire. They had slaughtered legions, desecrated eagles, and defied the might that subdued Gaul, crushed Carthage, and humbled kings. To allow such insolence to endure was to invite weakness into the heart of Rome. Titus knew this, and he swore to his father that he would bring Judea to heel or perish in the attempt. Yet Titus was no ordinary butcher. Beneath the stern exterior of a general lay a man capable of deep reflection, even mercy. Ancient accounts tell us that he wished, if possible, to spare the temple of Jerusalem, the second temple, the jewel of the city, the heart of Jewish faith. He understood that to destroy it would be to ignite a wound that might never heal. But he was also pragmatic. He knew that the empire's survival was worth more than sacred stone. He walked a knife's edge between restraint and ruthlessness, torn between his own conscience and the unyielding demands of Rome. When he rode among his soldiers, clad in the scarlet cloak of command, the legions saw in him both a leader and a comrade. He ate with them, slept in the dust of their camps, and bore the same scorching sun and desert winds. He was stern in discipline, yet generous in reward. To his men, he was no distant aristocrat, but a commander who shared their hardships. They followed him not merely out of duty, but out of loyalty, even love. For in him they recognized something rare, a Roman who could command without arrogance, who led by example rather than by decree. But within the walls of Jerusalem, his name was cursed. To the defenders, Titus was the executioner of their people, the wolf at their gates. From the ramparts they hurled insults and defiance, swearing that God would strike him down. And Titus, gazing upon the holy city, felt the enormity of his task. He was not fighting rebels alone. He was contending against a people whose very faith demanded resistance unto death. This was no ordinary war. It was a battle of wills, of cultures, of worlds colliding. As the siege dragged on, Titus revealed the steel of his resolve. He ordered the construction of a massive circumvallation wall, nearly 8 kilometers long, encircling the city in an unbreakable grip. His soldiers groaned at the labor, but Titus pressed them on, reminding them that only by cutting off the city's lifeblood could they force surrender. Slowly famine tightened its claws. The rebels grew desperate, Their infighting intensified, yet still they would not yield. At times Titus attempted negotiation. He offered clemency to those who laid down arms. Envoys carried his words into the city, urging the defenders to surrender and spare themselves annihilation. But the zealots within mocked him, spitting upon his mercy. They declared that God alone was their king, that Rome would never triumph over the chosen people. Each rejection hardened Titus's heart. Each insult fueled his determination to break them utterly. And so the young commander stood at the crossroads of history, to show mercy and risk humiliation, or to unleash Rome's wrath and etch his name into eternity. He chose both in a paradox that defined his legacy. He sought to preserve the temple, yet his legions, driven by fury, hunger, and the chaos of war, would one day set it aflame. He longed for a swift victory, yet the siege stretched on, testing his patience and his soul. Titus was a hero not in the sense of virtue alone, but in the ancient Roman sense. A man larger than life, shaped by destiny, both revered and feared. To his soldiers, he was the shining star of Rome's resurgence. To his father, he was the guarantor of a dynasty. To his enemies, he was the harbinger of ruin. In his hands lay the fate of Jerusalem, and with it, the future of an empire that demanded nothing less than absolute victory. As the fires of the siege crackled in the distance, Titus gazed upon the holy city one last time before the final assault. His heart was heavy, his will unbreakable. For he knew that history would not remember hesitation, only triumph. And triumph, whatever the cost, was the destiny of Rome. Rome was no stranger to bloodshed, but never had its veins run so dry as in the fateful year of 869, the year of the 4 emperors. In the span of 12 chaotic months, the empire saw Galba, Otho, Vitellius, and finally Vespasian rise and fall upon the shifting tides of ambition. Civil war, once thought unthinkable in the mighty empire of Augustus, tore across the provinces like a plague. Fields burned, coffers emptied, and the invincible facade of Rome cracked under the weight of its own discord. By the time Vespasian secured the purple, the empire was weary, bleeding, and fractured. The treasury lay hollow, plundered by pretenders who had lavished bribes upon fickle legions. Italy had been ravaged by armies that should never have fought one another. The Senate, once the proud heart of the Republic, had become little more than a chorus of fear and opportunism. Rome needed stability. Rome needed triumph. Rome needed proof that the Flavian dynasty, born not of noble lineage but of raw merit and iron discipline, could stand as the rightful ruler of the world. It was in this crucible of desperation that the fate of Jerusalem gained such weight. To the average Roman citizen, Judea was a distant and troublesome province, a land of strange customs and stubborn people. But to the emperor, Jerusalem became the stage upon which the legitimacy of his reign would be carved in fire. For if Vespasian and his son could crush the rebellion that had humiliated Rome, they would prove themselves worthy heirs to Caesar's legacy. The memory of Rome's disgrace lingered bitterly in the minds of her citizens. The revolt in Judea had begun with Roman cohorts slaughtered and their sacred standards desecrated. No insult cut deeper. Even the poorest citizen in the Subura, far from the battlefields of the East, knew that an eagle torn from its legion was a wound upon the empire itself. Rumors of Roman blood spilled in Jerusalem spread through taverns and marketplaces, poisoning pride with shame. The empire demanded revenge, and it demanded it swiftly. Yet revenge required coin, and Rome's coffers were perilously thin. The long civil war had drained the treasury. Soldiers demanded donatives for their loyalty, and the debts of emperors past weighed heavily upon the state. Vespasian, pragmatic to the core, understood that conquest was not only a matter of swords, but of silver. Judea's famed temple, laden with treasures gathered over centuries, gleamed like a promise. Its gold, its ornaments, its sacred offerings, all would one day march in triumph through the streets of Rome, replenishing the imperial purse and silencing doubts. But the crisis was more than financial. The legions themselves, the very backbone of Roman might, were fractured. Loyalties had been divided in the civil war. The armies of the Rhine had hailed Vitellius. The eastern legions had proclaimed Vespasian. Brothers had faced brothers across battlefields in Cremona, and Bedriacum. The scars of that fratricide lingered, discipline wavered, trust was fragile. Titus's campaign in Jerusalem would therefore serve another purpose: to reunite the legions under a common cause, to redirect their fury outward rather than inward, and to remind them that they were the sword of Rome, not pawns of ambition. Within the imperial court, whispers of doubt persisted. The Flavians were upstarts, provincials, men of equestrian roots rather than patrician grandeur. Vespasian's rise had been forged in the East, not in the aristocratic salons of Rome. To many senators, he was an interloper, a soldier upon the throne. What better way to silence them than through his son's victory? If Titus returned from Jerusalem crowned with laurel, the dynasty would be secured not by lineage, but by glory, the only currency Rome respected more than blood. The people of Rome, too, hungered for spectacle. They had endured famine, uncertainty, and war upon their own soil. Now they demanded the catharsis of conquest. They wished to see captives paraded in chains, to witness treasures gleaming in triumphal processions, to feel once more the intoxication of being the masters of the world. For the mob, bread and circuses were not enough. They required the assurance that Rome was still invincible. And so all eyes turned eastward, toward the walls of Jerusalem. But the stakes were higher still, for beyond politics, beyond wealth, beyond pride, there loomed the question of Rome's destiny. Was the empire truly eternal, or had the civil wars revealed its fragility? Could one man, risen from provincial obscurity, restore the majesty of Augustus and Tiberius? Vespasian had seized the throne, but it was Titus who would decide if the Flavians ruled by fortune or by fate. Thus, as the siege dragged on and reports trickled back to the capital, the empire trembled with anticipation. Senators whispered in marble halls, merchants speculated in the Forum, soldiers in distant outposts awaited word. Would Titus prevail? Would Jerusalem fall? The empire's breath was held as if the outcome in a distant land could determine the fate of all. And perhaps it could, for in the vast tapestry of Rome's history, certain moments burn brighter than others, moments where the entire weight of civilization seems to balance upon a knife's edge. The siege of Jerusalem was one such moment. It was not merely the fate of a city, nor of a rebellious province. It was the test of an emperor, the proving ground of a dynasty, the crucible in which Rome would either reaffirm her dominion or reveal her weakness. The city groaned under famine, the legions encircled its walls, and the empire itself stood on trembling ground. In that tension, in that breathless waiting, the heart of Rome beat not in the marble of the Forum, nor in the Senate's decrees, but in the dust and blood of Judea. If Rome embodied order, discipline, and the cold logic of empire, then Jerusalem in AD 70 embodied something far more volatile: faith sharpened into defiance, desperation honed into fury. To the Romans, the Jewish rebels were obstinate provincials. To themselves, they were warriors of God, chosen to resist the greatest power on earth, no matter the cost. And in the labyrinthine streets of Jerusalem, with its walls soaring high, they became an enemy unlike any Rome had faced. The city itself was a fortress. Jerusalem sat upon rugged hills, girded by ravines that turned every approach into a gauntlet. 3 concentric walls enclosed its heart, each formidable in its own right. The outer wall, broad and newly constructed, bristled with towers and battlements. Behind it lay the second wall, older but still formidable, encircling the city's upper quarters. And at the core stood the Antonia fortress and the Temple Mount, a citadel within a citadel, rising like a crown above the holy city. To breach Jerusalem was not merely to capture a city, but to conquer a mountain of stone and faith. Within these walls, the defenders drew upon a resource Rome could never fully comprehend: zeal. Many of the fighters were not professional soldiers, but farmers, artisans, priests, men who had exchanged plows and tools for swords and spears. Yet their resolve was iron, their courage fanatical. They believed that God himself dwelt within their city, that to yield was to betray the covenant, and that to fall in battle was to win eternal honor. Against such conviction, even Rome's steel trembled. The zealots were fierce and uncompromising. They roamed the city armed and unafraid, striking terror into collaborators, silencing dissent, and swearing that Jerusalem would never kneel. Their leaders, John of Gischala, Simon bar Giora, and Eleazar ben Simon, were men of fire and iron. Each commanded their own faction, their own following, and their own vision for Judea. Yet their passion was both their strength and their curse. For rather than uniting against the legions outside their gates, they often turned their swords upon one another. Civil strife gnawed at Jerusalem's heart. John and Simon, though both sworn to resist Rome, despised one another more than they hated Titus. Skirmishes broke out in the streets, rival bands torching each other's supplies, cutting down each other's men. In a city already strangled by siege, they destroyed their own food stores to prevent rivals from gaining advantage, condemning their people to famine. It was as if madness had taken root, as though divine wrath had turned them against themselves. Yet even amidst such chaos, their resistance was ferocious. Every breach in the wall became a death trap. Roman battering rams shattered gates only to be met with cascades of stones, flaming pitch, and desperate men leaping down from the battlements with daggers in hand. Streets turned into arenas of slaughter, where rebels fought with the ferocity of lions cornered in their den. Women hurled tiles and boiling oil from rooftops, children carried water and stones to the front lines, and priests prayed as they bled. What the Romans saw as barbaric frenzy was, to the defenders, sacred duty. The temple stood as their heart, the dwelling of their God, the place where heaven touched earth. To protect it was not merely to fight for survival, but to fight for the very soul of their people. They believed that divine power would intervene, that angels would descend, that Rome would be struck down for its hubris. Each day the city held out was seen as proof that heaven favored their cause. And indeed, the longer the siege dragged on, the more formidable they appeared. For though hunger hollowed their bodies, though disease spread through the packed quarters, their spirit did not break. They endured, fueled by visions of deliverance, convinced that Rome could bleed, that empire could falter. Titus himself marveled at their tenacity. Time and again he offered terms of surrender, promising mercy if they would only yield. Time and again they spat defiance. To them, death was preferable to chains. To them, the burning of their city was less terrifying than submission to foreign gods and foreign masters. The Romans, disciplined and ruthless, found themselves fighting not only walls of stone, but walls of faith. Machines of war tore at the fortifications, but the defenders rebuilt by night. Siege towers rose, only to be set ablaze by daring sorties. For every breach opened, the rebels turned 10 alleys into fortresses. Jerusalem became a maze of resistance, where every turn concealed another ambush, another band of zealots hurling themselves at the might of Rome. And yet, even as they fought like lions, the cracks deepened. Famine ravaged the city. Corpses littered the streets, their stench choking the air. Mothers wept over lifeless children. Hunger drove some to madness, even to cannibalism, as ancient chroniclers grimly record. But still the zealots refused to yield. Still they fought, convinced that suffering was the price of redemption, that Rome's patience would shatter before theirs. To the Romans, these defenders were maddened fanatics, blind to reason, deaf to mercy. To the Jews, they were martyrs and patriots, the last guardians of their faith. In that collision of perception lay the tragedy of Jerusalem, a people willing to destroy themselves rather than surrender, a city transformed into both a battlefield and a tomb. Rome had faced great enemies before: Hannibal of Carthage, Mithridates of Pontus, the Gauls under Vercingetorix, but never an enemy so consumed by holy fire. Against the legions stood not merely men, but an idea that faith could defy empire, that the weak could resist the mighty, that God could humble Caesar. And so the defenders of Jerusalem, starving yet unbowed, bloodied yet unbroken, became the most formidable enemy Rome could imagine. Their defiance ensured that the siege would not be a simple conquest, but a war of attrition, a crucible of faith and fire. They were doomed perhaps, but in their doom they became immortal, symbols of resistance that no legion, no emperor, could ever fully erase. Titus did not see himself merely as a general. In the eyes of his soldiers, he was a restorer, a man entrusted with Rome's dignity at a moment when the empire teetered on the edge of fragility. Jerusalem was not just a city, It was a symbol of defiance that had to be crushed so decisively that no province would ever again dare to rise. To achieve this, Titus resolved to wield not only the sword, but hunger, despair, and terror as his allies. The young general understood that the walls of Jerusalem were more than stone. They were embodiments of faith, zeal, and an unshakable will. No frontal assault, however bold, would suffice. Instead, he reached deep into Rome's arsenal of strategy, the patient art of the siege. "If they worship defiance," Titus is said to have murmured, "then let us starve their gods." First came the encirclement. His legions moved with mechanical precision, driving stakes into the earth, raising earthen ramparts, and binding the city in chains of timber and stone. In less than 3 days, the Romans had built a circumvallation, a wall nearly 8 kilometers long, bristling with watchtowers and patrols. Every gate was sealed, every path scouted, every hope of escape extinguished. Birds overhead and rats beneath the ground had more freedom than the besieged defenders. Within Jerusalem, starvation began its cruel work. Once proud warriors turned scavengers. Mothers searched the dust for crumbs. Infighting, which had once been political, devolved into madness as rival factions fought over dwindling stores of grain. Josephus, the Jewish chronicler who witnessed the horror, later wrote of people gnawing on leather, chewing on scraps of old parchment, and worse, atrocities whispered in hushed tones, born of desperation. Titus knew hunger would do what 1,000 battering rams could not: sap the will of a city, but he was no passive spectator. Around the walls, his engineers constructed towering siege engines, wooden monsters braced with iron, taller than Jerusalem's gates. Massive ballistae hurled stones that shattered roofs and crushed defenders who dared peer over the ramparts. Catapults rained fire upon the temple's outer courts, sparks leaping like vengeful spirits into the night sky. To the Jews inside, it seemed as though heaven itself had turned against them. Titus walked among his men, calm and unyielding. He encouraged the weary, punished the careless, rewarded valor, and reminded all of them that Rome's reputation hung on their shoulders. "If Jerusalem resists," he told his officers, "then the whole East will remember our weakness. But if it falls, all will remember our strength." His presence was both a promise and a threat. The war would end here, in victory or annihilation. Still, the defenders fought with fury. When Roman rams battered the outer wall, Jewish warriors poured boiling oil, flaming torches and stones upon them. Titus watched entire cohorts burn alive, but he did not flinch. Losses could be replaced, but resolve must remain intact. "Stone is stubborn," he remarked to his tribunes, "but so is Rome." His strategy shifted to relentless pressure. Day and night, his soldiers rotated at the siege towers. Engineers reinforced rams with iron plates. Archers fired ceaselessly to cover advancing infantry. When one wall cracked, the defenders fell back to the next, but Titus pressed forward, layer by layer, like a lion driving prey into a corner. Jerusalem's triple defenses, once a source of invincibility, became stages in its slow demise. It was not merely a conquest of arms. It was a psychological war. Each time Roman engines thundered against the walls, Titus made certain the sound echoed across the valley, letting despair seep deeper into the hearts of the besieged. Each day the Roman camps blazed with bonfires, feasts, and songs, reminding the starving city of the abundance that surrounded them, yet remained forever out of reach. Some accounts claim Titus offered surrender terms, urging the Jews to yield and spare their holy places. But inside the city, zealotry ruled. To surrender was betrayal. To fight was divine duty. Their refusal only strengthened Titus's resolve. Rome had offered mercy and been spurned. Now Rome would show its wrath. Weeks stretched into months. Corpses piled in the streets, unburied, their stench rising with the summer heat. Famine hollowed eyes and withered limbs, yet the defenders clung to their faith. But faith cannot feed the stomach, and zeal cannot mend shattered walls. The city was breaking. At last, Titus gave the order for the final storm. Siege towers lurched forward, rams smashed through weakened gates, and legionaries surged into the maze of streets. Every alley became a battleground, every rooftop a fortress. Fire spread uncontrollably, leaping from house to house, consuming the sacred temple itself. The sky above Jerusalem glowed red, a funeral pyre for a nation's hope. And yet, amid the horror, Titus commanded restraint. Some sources suggest he tried to save the temple, the jewel of Jerusalem, but his soldiers, intoxicated by blood and vengeance, defied him. Flames engulfed the sanctuary, its golden treasures melting into rivers of molten light. The destruction was irreversible. When the smoke cleared, Jerusalem was no more than a carcass of stone and ash. Titus stood at its gates, weary yet triumphant. He had not merely captured a city, he had broken a rebellion, reshaped a province, and handed his father Vespasian the gift of legitimacy. The Flavian dynasty, born in civil war, was reborn in conquest. Rome had found its rebirth in fire. From the ashes of Jerusalem, the empire emerged renewed, its authority unquestioned, its might proclaimed to the world. The legions marched back beneath standards now heavy with spoils and glory. And at their head rode Titus, the shepherd of Rome's vengeance, the architect of her renewal. The summer of AD 70 burned hotter than any before. Jerusalem, once a beacon of faith and resilience, had become a furnace of suffering. The Roman war machine had chewed through its walls, its streets, and its people with relentless appetite. By August, the city was no longer a sanctuary of God, but a graveyard for hope. The final storming of Jerusalem unfolded with a thunderous inevitability. Roman rams shattered the last gates, and legions poured through the breaches. Shields overlapped in disciplined formations. Swords glinted in the smoke, and the eagle standards rose above the chaos like divine harbingers. The defenders fought with despairing ferocity, wielding broken spears, stones, and even bare hands. Fathers died beside sons, women hurled tiles from rooftops, and children screamed prayers that vanished into the roar of battle. Yet against the tide of Rome, courage became futility. The temple, the soul of Jerusalem, stood at the heart of the inferno. Flames licked its outer courts, ignited by torches hurled from Roman hands, or perhaps by the uncontrollable fury of battle. Ancient cedar beams crackled, gold plating melted into rivulets, and smoke billowed heavenward like a dark offering. Some chroniclers say Titus tried to halt the fire, desiring to preserve the sacred monument as a trophy. But the tide of war was stronger than his command. Soldiers, drunk on slaughter and glory, pressed onward, their blades wet, their eyes wild. In hours, the holiest shrine of Israel was consumed, collapsing in a roar that seemed to echo across the ages. For the defenders, this was the end. With their temple gone, their city ablaze, and their ranks shattered, resistance dissolved into tragedy. Some leapt into the flames rather than submit. Others were dragged in chains, destined for the slave markets of Rome. Thousands were crucified outside the walls. So many that wood for crosses ran short. The once mighty Jerusalem had become a tableau of ash, ruin, and silence. Titus walked the desolate streets, his armor blackened by soot, his face marked by fatigue. Yet his gaze was not of a conqueror drunk on victory, but of a man who understood the magnitude of what had transpired. He had not only subdued a rebellion, he had extinguished a nation's heart. Behind him his legions cheered, but before him the ruins smoldered, a grim reminder of the cost of empire. News of Jerusalem's fall raced ahead of the legions. Across the provinces, whispers grew into proclamations. Rome had triumphed. The eastern provinces, long uncertain after the chaos of the Year of the Four Emperors, now bent willingly beneath Flavian authority. Vespasian, who had risen from the dust of civil war, was suddenly a legitimate emperor, crowned not by senatorial decree, but by the fire and steel of conquest. Jerusalem's ashes became the foundation stones of the Flavian dynasty. When Titus and his father returned to Rome, the city erupted in jubilation. The triumphal procession was one of the grandest ever seen. The streets were adorned with garlands. Musicians played triumphal hymns, and citizens showered the victors with laurel wreaths. Before the cheering masses paraded the spoils of Jerusalem, golden menorahs, sacred trumpets, and treasures rested from the temple's vaults. Shackled prisoners walked behind, emaciated survivors of a fallen people. And towering above all, The victorious standards gleamed in the Roman sun. The climax of the celebration was the construction of the Arch of Titus, an enduring monument carved in marble. Upon its reliefs were immortalized the menorah and the sacred vessels, carried by Roman soldiers in eternal stone. It was not merely art, but propaganda, an immortal reminder that Rome, even when fractured by civil war, could rise, unite, and crush its enemies with divine authority. Every citizen who passed beneath that arch was reminded of the price of rebellion and the glory of Rome's vengeance. For Titus himself, the triumph was both crowning and haunting. Though he basked in adoration, he could never erase the memories of smoke and screams, the faces of the starving, the ruin of a city once sacred. History would paint him as both conqueror and destroyer, restorer of Rome and annihilator of Jerusalem. His name would echo in hymns of praise in the Forum and in dirges of lamentation across Judea. Such is the paradox of empire. To be hailed as savior by one people is to be cursed as scourge by another. And yet, from the perspective of Rome, this was rebirth. The empire, weary from internal strife, found unity in conquest. The Flavian dynasty emerged secure, its legitimacy bathed in the fire of victory. The East lay pacified, the provinces subdued, and the eagle standard soared unchallenged across the Mediterranean world. From the ruins of Jerusalem, Rome proclaimed its eternal destiny, that no city, no nation, no faith could defy her and endure. Thus ended the siege of Jerusalem, not merely as a military victory, but as a turning point in the story of empire. It was a clash not only of armies but of ideals, faith against power, zeal against discipline, defiance against destiny. And in the crucible of fire, Rome emerged ascendant, her legacy seared into stone and story alike. Even now, centuries later, the fall of Jerusalem remains more than history. It is a lesson carved in fire, that empires rise not through mercy but through might, and that every rebellion, no matter how fierce, faces the shadow of Rome's wrath. The city burned, the temple fell, but the empire endured, reborn in blood, immortal in triumph.